Morning guys, it's great to be with you and to continue our ongoing series on the Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer, which is just such a great book and something which really speaks into this time that we're living in at the moment. And so I'm looking at our second practice in the book today, which is Sabbath. And as Dave will tell you, I've been desperate to talk about this theme of Sabbath or rest for pretty much the entire time that I've been at the church so far. Every time Dave asks for suggestions of topics for either a series or a one-off talk, he always gets a response from me saying, let's talk about Sabbath, let's talk about rest. But the reason why is because this has been a deeply transformative practice for me. When I used to work in my previous job at Regents, I was in a rhythm of overworking. Each week I put in about 80 plus hours of work, trying to juggle the combination of my job, planting a church and doing a master's as well. I was driven to produce and to be active. Weekends would be spent catching up on work from the previous week and trying to get things sorted for church the next day. And because I felt like I didn't deserve or wasn't capable of doing my role as a lecturer, I put extra hours in to try and make up for it. And so then alongside the physical and emotional issues, things like depression, migraine, sickness and eventually full-on burnout, my spirituality was being sapped away as well. God was a taskmaster for me, expecting more and more work from me. I felt as if my value from both other men but also from God was found in what I could do, what I could produce, what I could make happen or achieve. This isn't an isolated case. Our culture as a whole today beats to this same rhythm of productivity and busyness. If you don't believe me, in fact, I've just literally watched a YouTube video, a worship song, and before it came on, there's an advert for Nurofen which says this: at Nurofen, we know demanding lives can cause headaches, but pain should never be in charge of your day. You do the full-on day and we'll do the fast-acting headache release. So Nurofen are literally advertising at the moment for us to ignore the warning systems of our body for a busy life. That's the culture we're in. Our whole economic system has changed. We live in the age of consumerism. At its heart, consumerism is a system based on making us feel inadequate and dissatisfied. We're perpetually restless. Items which are in essence luxuries or leisure items become things that we need because they're marketed to us as such. And so we enter into this vicious cycle where in order for us to stop feeling inadequate and feel satisfied, we work to produce enough stuff of value to be able to buy something or get a promotion or be seen to be completing a new project. All of this for a moment makes us feel adequate, but it's just a passing breeze, because then we see another advert, or we compare ourselves to another friend, or we see a new career milestone, or we find a new project to be part of, or we feel judged by another stranger, and we go back to the beginning, feeling restless, feeling the need to produce, striving for the next thing, the next level, not feeling content. This is not the way of God though. This is not the mode of existence that God chooses for us. It's no coincidence that God first instructs the people of Israel to follow the Sabbath in the book of Exodus. Exodus contains the story, of course, of the Israelites' journey to freedom from slavery in Egypt. And Egyptian culture is something that won't sound particularly alien to us. It was a wealthy nation, but it feared not remaining wealthy, and so it continued to produce. So much so it had to build cities purely for the purpose of being storage units. But to maintain this 24/7 culture of production, they used multitudes of slaves. They forced people into labour. But aside from just the workers on the ground, the whole culture, from the lowest slave right to the very top in Pharaoh, was obsessed with striving forward, moving forward, onto the next thing, produce, onto the next thing. And the Israelites in Exodus 1 become the latest batch of people fully enslaved in Egypt. Upon the death of Joseph, who'd protected them previously, they're now put to work. They're told to build 2 of these storage cities, in Pithom and Ramses. God's people are put to work with no breaks. And they know if they don't produce enough, they won't be fed. They'll be beaten, they'll be whipped, imprisoned, or even possibly killed. They're given a daily quota of bricks that they have to complete. And then as punishment for Moses asking for them to be freed in Exodus 5, Pharaoh decides to punish them by no longer giving them straw to make the bricks. But he still insists upon the same daily quota, so now suddenly the Israelites have got to work harder because they've got to gather the straw themselves before they can even start making the same number of bricks as before. The Pharaoh punishes them with harder work, because he knows as well that whilst they're working, they've no time to worship God or feel content in his presence. They keep crying out to God, but all they get is more work from the Pharaoh. And so eventually Moses leads them out and they're free. But the scars and that way of life still remain. I said at the start, in my old life, I burnt out my old job. It's 3 years later now, but I'm still recovering physically from that. It can take up to 5 years to regain full capacity from that. Not just that, but it's only been recently that I finally began to understand and live out a life where I understand more who God truly is. Not a harsh cosmic taskmaster, but a God who loves me and cares for me simply for who I am, not for what I've done or achieved. How true must this have been for the Israelites? They've escaped a culture where they are desperately needing to prove their value through their work, because if they don't, they might not even eat. And so now God has to begin this process of re-educating them. Exodus 16 tells us that immediately after they've escaped from Pharaoh's armies, God begins this process. In fact, having just escaped, the Israelites are sat around and they immediately begin to regret leaving the country, thinking back to the mountains of food that were stored up and saying, how are we going to eat now? And yet God says this in verses 4 and 5 of Exodus 16. Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain bread down from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they follow my instruction. On the 6th day they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as what they gather on other days. And so, just as God says, the very next day, once the dew clears from the grass, there's bread all over the ground, and they take it and they prepare it and they eat it. And some of them save it thinking perhaps there's not going to be any of this tomorrow, but it goes mouldy overnight because the next morning God again provides bread for them. And the next, and the next, and the next. And then verses 22 to 30 in the passage tell us this. On the 6th day they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person, and the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He said to them, this is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until morning. So they saved it until morning as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. Eat it today, Moses said, because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground today. 6 days you are to gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will be none. Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather it, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath, that is why on the 6th day he gives you the bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the 7th day. No one is to go out. So the people rested on the 7th day. This is the second recorded Sabbath, and we'll touch on the first one later on. But I just want to think about this for a moment for the Israelites. They've been enslaved in Egypt for over 200 years, possibly over 400 depending on which books you read. Can you imagine what a first day off feels like after 200 years? Can you imagine experiencing the first day off in your family since your great-great-great-grandfather who had one over 200 years ago? And for the next month, this cycle continues. 4 weeks of Israel waking up each day to find bread literally falling from the sky, and every week having one day which is a day of rest. Suddenly they've gone from a culture where their well-being Their family and literally the food on their table is dependent on them being able to produce enough day after day, 24/7, to now them doing nothing and being able to rely on God providing manna from heaven. Not only that, but he tells them on the seventh day to not even bother doing that, but just stop and be content with what they already have, what God's already provided. And after 4 weeks of this re-educative work by God, the people of Israel then receive the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20. These 10 fundamental principles for Judaism and Christianity, famous now even as being the bedrock of our Western culture. And in amongst those 10 commandments, which are held in esteem amongst the other 600 rules that Judaism follows, is keeping the Sabbath. God places equal importance on keeping the Sabbath as he does on not worshipping other gods, not committing adultery, not stealing, not killing another human being. God says the Sabbath is as important as those things. And yet how often do we break it now even? The problem is, one of the big problems with the idea of Sabbath is that we hold it up with so many legalistic connotations, don't we? In our 21st century Western mindset, it seems like an imposition. It seems like a negative thing. I remember as a child seeing Jewish families travelling to the synagogue near our house on a Saturday. They chose to do Sabbath on Saturday. That's the day they believe that Sabbath is meant to be done on. And as part of the Sabbath, modern Orthodox Jews don't use their cars because it breaks some of the rules. Specifically, it's setting fire to something. They're not allowed to do that, so you can't use your car. And so you would see families walking along, streaming to the service, but then also as you got closer to the start time, you'd catch out some of those families that have had a little bit too much of a lie-in. And they'd be arriving in cars and parking a few streets along and then sort of hurriedly walking out and making their way around, making sure no one had spotted them in their car. Occasionally, if you were lucky enough, you'd spot 2 families arriving at the same time doing this. And they'd give each other that look of saying, if you won't tell, we won't tell. This for me is what happens when you view the Sabbath as an imposition, a rule, a legalistic thing. This is following, or at least trying to be seen to be following, the letter of the law, but missing entirely the heart and the spirit of it. In Mark 2, Jesus and his disciples get into trouble whilst walking through a grain field. I don't know whether Theresa May was there with them or not. But anyway, they're passing through this field on their Sabbath, and a couple of the followers take some grain to eat as little snacks. And the local Pharisees see this and they're outraged, but also delighted, as people who see people breaking rules often are. And they accuse Jesus of breaking the Sabbath. But Jesus speaks with them for a while, and at the end of it he says, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath." The Pharisees are obsessed here with following the law. For them, observance of the letter of the law is the very essence of their faith. So much so they've actually made little gods out of each of these various laws, instead of focusing on how those laws are supposed to bring them into the presence of Yahweh. But I love Jesus' response here, because first of all he demonstrates his authority, and if it were God's will he could have simply abolished the Sabbath right there and then. He could have said, that's it, it's done. But instead he turns it around and he reminds them of the heart of God, that Sabbath was made for man, not man for Sabbath. The Sabbath is a gift from God to humanity. The Sabbath is a period each week to rest, but also to recalibrate ourselves and understand that we live out of God's providence for us. He didn't tell the Israelites in the desert not to eat bread on the seventh day to test their ability to follow the rules. He did it to see if they trusted in God enough to believe that he would provide for them. Not only that, but to help them out, he provided for them every day for 6 days before even asking them to trust him for just one day. He blessed them mightily and said, look how I've blessed you. Can you not believe that I'm going to provide for you on this one day that you rest? The Sabbath is a gift, and it's not something that we should forget about, because I believe actually it's just as relevant now as it was back then. It's a simple concept. That each week for one 24-hour period we will just stop. That's literally the meaning of the word Sabbath. Stop. Stop striving. Stop working. Stop hurrying. Rabbi Akkad Hayim said this about the Sabbath. More than Israel has preserved the Sabbath has preserved Israel. You see, it's continued to be a focal point for Jewish families to this day. At sundown on a Friday night, they gather as a family, they change into special clothes to celebrate. They light candles and they have a big meal. And they turn off their phones, their tablets, their laptops, etc. And they embrace 24 hours of family rest together. The parents don't work. The children don't do homework. They go for walks, they pray and they talk. It's a time of refreshment for individuals, for families, for everyone to reconnect with God. It's no surprise that these family units seem so much stronger than those around them in our culture now. But I believe this is a time for cultural pushback for Christians to embrace the Sabbath. And to be clear, I'm not talking about the kind of Sunday Sabbath culture of the American church, which has been really popularised, which is more geared towards kind of legalism and prohibitive rules, although there are things that I think we should think about, like Sunday trading. If we buy in stuff on a Sunday, are we contributing to people having to work 7 days a week? But I'm not talking about that specifically. I'm talking about Sabbath as a weekly rhythm, which does three things. It gives us rest, it teaches us to be content and reminds us of God's provision, and it connects us with God. This is why Thursday is my Sabbath day, because it's my day off during the week. And when I turn off my work phone at 9 or 9:30 on a Wednesday, it is honestly my favourite feeling of the week, because the Sabbath is my favourite moment of the week. No more texts, no more emails, no more projects, no thinking of ideas for work, no hard practical stuff. I've stopped. I am resting. I am content. And I'm thankful for all the incredible blessings in my life. And I'm joyfully reminded as well that actually my Sabbath day is my true existence, where I'm not defined by what I do or achieve, but instead I live in God's love. I play golf, I read, I go for walks, I watch some telly, I play some games. Hannah and I go and get a coffee. I recharge, I feel content. And then the key is that I live the rest of the week out of that day. I carry my rest with me. I feel content, valued and provided for. I feel connected to God for the rest of that week. You might be saying to me at this point, it's all right for you, Eddie, you work for the church. Or you just don't understand, Eddie, what I'm doing is really important. Or perhaps you're saying, Eddie, look, I'm just in a busy patch. I'll try this after Christmas. But for now, things are just difficult. I just need to work through it. Let me say this to you. First of all, I started this rhythm when I was working as a caretaker back home in Southport during my year out after I'd finished working at Regents. I do it not because I work for the church. I do it because I'm human. And as human beings, we need it. The first recorded Sabbath was taken by God. After 6 days of creating the whole of the earth and the universe, it says that on the seventh day, God rested. God models to us before time even really begins that Sabbath is more important for human beings than many other things. Secondly, and finally here, I want to tell you a story about things being too important to rest, to find time to rest. The closest that Britain ever came to being invaded by the Nazis during World War II was during the Battle of Britain. From mid-July to the end of October in 1940, the German Air Force bombarded the British coast, aiming to wipe out the RAF in order to make a sea invasion earlier. It was a desperate time for Britain. The Germans had more planes and more pilots than the British, and with most of Europe taken over, they also had capacity to build planes faster and train pilots quicker. And yet, amongst this, with daily raids against cities and air bases that were constantly short of pilots, Fighter Command still maintained that every single RAF pilot would have one 24-hour period of rest every 7 days. 24 hours with no flying, No meetings, no planning, no reports, and time off away from the base to refresh. On the other side of the channel, Hermann Goering, desperate for a result for Hitler, revoked all leave and rest time. And so German pilots were going 12, 15 days without a break, let alone a full 24-hour period. They would fly over, drop their bombs, return to the base, have a couple of hours sitting around before heading back out again for another bombing run. The results of this were astounding. During that period, Britain lost 544 pilots, whereas Germany lost 2,585. James Holland, the historian, in his book called War in the West, suggests that the decision by fighter command to rest their pilots was pivotal to British victory. He says they understood that for pilots to perform best under the immense pressure they were facing, they had to stop and rest. Their work was too important for them not to. In the most desperate and urgent situation faced by this country, they knew their work was too important for them not to rest. What makes us any different? I want to end by leading us in a prayer of confession to finish. But if you are wanting to really explore the practices of Sabbath, I encourage you to check out the resources on John's website that are alongside this book. And if you're really keen, I encourage you to get this book, Sabbath as Resistance by Walter Brueggemann, which is just absolutely beautiful, looking at how we practice Sabbath in our modern day culture. And drop me a line as well, because I am keen. I've got so many other things that I'd love to talk about and reflect on, but I've tried to condense it, so just let me know if you want to have a chat. But be encouraged as well that this isn't something that we can change overnight necessarily. God fed Israel on manna for 40 years before they got their head around it. So let us pray. I just encourage you, whether you're at home or at church, to stand now and open your heart to God as we pray a prayer of confession. Father God, we're sorry for the times we've brought into a culture which makes us feel discontent and dissatisfied. We're sorry for the times we've broken your command to keep the Sabbath. We're sorry, Lord, if we've not lived lives of example for the generations below to work out of their rest with you. Would you forgive us and help us to live out a life of restfulness now? We're sorry, Lord, if we've judged other people or even ourselves as lazy or not valuable for what they do. Would you forgive us and let us know your love and value for who we are? We're sorry, Lord, if we've pushed our children into lifestyles where they never get a break from homework, clubs, groups or chores. Would you forgive us and help us to model something different now? We're sorry, Lord, if we've doubted your provision in our lives. Would you help us to recognise your blessing and live in your goodness? We thank you for the gift of the Sabbath, Lord. Would you give us the strength to take on the challenge of practicing it? And all of God's people said, Amen.